So how would you define domestic violence, I guess, in a kind of small statement?
Sure. So domestic violence is really, it's about power and control of one person over another in an intimate relationship. The victim of that can be male, female, transgender. It can really be anybody, despite race, ethnicity, social economic status, gender. There's no real, definitive victim. It's really widespread.
What are the characteristics of a domestic violence perpetrator, and what you would say?
Oh, well, they're usually very gregarious. You would never know somebody is a domestic violence perpetrator out in the community or in the world. Usually, they're very fun-loving. They're typically the person you would never expect out in the world, but behind closed doors, they're very controlling. They're very manipulative. They use intimidation, coercion, verbal, psychological abuse to their victims. They obviously, there's not always a physical component, but there's obviously physical abuse that goes on, threats. A lot of our clients describe it as just kind of siphoning away their power and their independence to where they feel like they have nothing or no one. And so they're very skilled at taking away their victim's power.
What do you think, is there a difference between a domestic violence situation and just an abusive relationship? Is there a difference in your opinion?
So really the difference between abuse and domestic violence is abuse is just one component of domestic violence. If you think about domestic violence as kind of an umbrella for kind of the dynamics that are occurring in a relationship, it's a pervasive pattern over time. Oftentimes it can start out very small and get more intense over time. So you see more frequent abuse, you see the intensity of abuse over time become greater and greater in the relationship, where abuse is, like I said, one part of that, and it can be in a relationship, abuse can occur between both parties. So you can have two people that are unhealthy, that are verbally abusive to one another or physically abusive towards one another, but one person doesn't have all the power. In domestic violence, you have one person has all the power, where abuse can be mutual. Does that make sense?
Yeah. You kind of explained this, but what are some early signs to look for in a intimate relationship with someone?
So red flags, a lot of the things we talk about is when somebody becomes very serious very fast, when they start becoming very controlling about where their victim is going, who they're with, they start monitoring their activities, especially like on social media, grabbing their phone, looking at their text messages, asking where they were. So a lot of that almost micromanaging of the other person in the relationship, extreme jealousy very early on. But it's very hard because typically it's kind of interwoven with this like you're the love of my life. And that often can be said very early in those relationships, almost to hook a victim in. And manipulative, like, well, you're the only one I can trust or talk to where the victim feels kind of equally important, but also, kind of feeling like their time is being completely consumed by their partner. So those are some of the early signs.
What do you think, or why do you think it is difficult for victims to come forward and ask for help when they're in a situation?
It depends on the situation, but a lot of times it's fear of retaliation. One of the most lethal times in domestic violence is when they choose to leave. And, up to the point of asking for help, there's usually a lot of threats and coercion. So it could be, if you ever leave me, I'll make sure you'll never see your kids again, or I'll make sure that the judge knows you're crazy. There's a lot of manipulation and brainwashing that can go into it. When a lot of people don't know about what's happening behind closed doors, even a victim's closest friends and family members sometimes have no idea, because it can feel very shaming. Like, if they knew what I was living with, what would they think of me? Or, how would they judge me? And even almost this protection over their partner. Like, I don't want them to think badly about him or her. And kind of protecting that at the same time. A lot of our clients kind of go to this place of like, sometimes the devil you know is better than the devil you don't. So at least I know what to expect when I walk in that door, versus if I leave, I will never know what to expect.
Right. Do you think there's anything that would make it easier for victims to leave, or is it just more the manipulation that prevents them?
In terms of how society and law enforcement can support them, I think one of the things that can make it easier is just to feel like they can trust law enforcement and the court system to protect them as best they can, in terms of like getting protection orders in place, whether it's a restraining order if there's criminal activity, or a civil protection order which protects them based on a series of threats or events that the perpetrator wasn't arrested for to make it criminal, but that they present this information to the judge and the judge grants them a protection order. I think people would feel safer if they could rely upon that system's support. In terms of what else can make it easier, obviously services like we provide, like giving them information, helping them devise a safety plan, encouraging them to reach out to their support network, helping connect them to other victims and feeling like they're not alone in it, I think can make it easier.
How does exposure to domestic violence affect children in their lives ahead?
I have a whole 4-hour presentation on that, actually. So the short answer, in the moment, remembering children learn what they live. So that is their normal, and which can be very detrimental. So a child's belief system is shaped by what they're witnessing day in and day out between their parents. And, that's what they believe is true of those gender roles, perhaps. Or, a lot of kids we see kind of aligning with the victim or the perpetrator. Kids will be in a state of survival, so they might align with the perpetrator in the relationship because they feel like that's the safer person to align with, because that's their own self-preservation. And then, then they feel like they have to betray the other parent. Or vice versa, they align with the victim because they feel like they need to intrinsically protect that other parent from the abusive parent. And so you can imagine the anxiety that starts, the depression, the low self-esteem, the fear can consume them living in that environment. And what does the world see of this child? They go into school and maybe they're the kid that is having a hard time concentrating, or that isn't having an easy time making friends, or maybe it's the bully on the playground, but really that's just kind of the symptoms that people don't realize what's behind that. So sometimes these kids get mislabeled, with ADHD, or oppositional defiant, when really these kids are just trying to survive in the midst of all this trauma. So that's kind of the short-term consequences. Long-term consequences, like we talked about earlier, they can, they're more susceptible to being a victim or a perpetrator later in life, because if this is their blueprint, if this is what their normal looks like, they're going to perpetuate that same cycle, even subconsciously, but in their future relationships. We start to see that even in teen dating relationships. So we start to see teen dating violence emerge, and oftentimes they witnessed it, and whether they're the victim side of it or the perpetrator side of it. And then long-term consequences, even into adulthood, we can see increase in addictions, so substance abuse, depression, anxiety, post-traumatic stress disorder. So one of the things we really promote here is early intervention to stop that cycle and to kind of heal some of those wounds early.
And like one final thing, what do you have to say to someone who is in a situation or knows someone in a situation of domestic violence or abuse?
That you will be believed. A lot of victims are conditioned by their perpetrator that nobody will believe them, that people will think they're crazy, that they'll think it's their fault. So the first thing is that you will be believed and supported, and that you have strength that you're not even aware is there sometimes.